Hi. So I'm going to do a bit of presentation bingo. So here's some of the things you can check off as I go through my presentation. I've actually can check off the MacBook Air one or the MacBook, seeing as it was going to be done on my PC, but my PC didn't work. So we do have the MacBook now. What I'm going to do though as well is, unlike, I'm going to talk about the journey that I've been on around Agile. And one of the things I should have done when Ash was talking was, he's obviously been on an emotional journey, I think, safe to say. What I would say is that I should have had my hand up when he said too many tests. So I have been responsible for a project. I was trying to think back, was it my fault? And it probably was partly my fault. But I have been responsible for projects where I've had testers who have automated the creation of tests, and they've been using Python to write fitness. And two of these testers were able to turn out about 1,000 of these tests a day. And this was unsustainable to the point where they couldn't run these tests in a single universe. They were able to create them much quicker than they could actually run them. And that did end in a conversation I've had on more than one occasion when I had to say, so do we run the tests? And they're saying, no, we don't have time to run the tests. But you have got time to write more tests. And then there was a question and how many releases have I done without you running the tests? So I should have had my hand up very, very tall saying, yes, I have had far too many tests. So what I'm going to talk about today is an Agile journey. So it's my experience of Agile and XP. I'm going to do a slightly longer biography than perhaps most people do, mainly because I think it's relevant to hopefully what the talk is about. And what the talk I'm trying to do, it's about the journey that's important, it's not the destination. I've also put in a couple of David Bowie quotes in as well because of when I was doing my slides a little bit late. So we'll swiftly move on. The other thing I should say as well, I always have an apology whenever I'm going to do a talk because I was still writing the slides about 6:15, so I haven't timed this. So we'll have to see how we do with time. I have got some spare slides which I can cut out if I'm going too slow. Yep, so that's just a black and white photo of me to flatter. So, biography. So, I started the program 79 or 1980 when I was about 10 on a Commodore PET, which I'm sure very few people will be aware of in this room. So that's perhaps just showing my experience or my age. I started the program for real, or my first real IT job was when I was at a company called EMIS. Do we have anyone from EMIS? Sometimes we get people from EMIS. Does that smile? Yes? No? You've heard of them? So that was my first proper IT job, doing clinical software for GPs. Kind of look back on how we behaved in the 90s compared to how we behave now around clinical software, and we've certainly moved forward. What I realized when I was learning to develop was I didn't get any help about how to develop, but I was very good at developing, certainly when I was younger. But I didn't know what I was doing. It took me a long time to work out how to develop properly. And the start of that journey for me was when in those days I was writing Delphi code, I was writing what I thought was object-oriented code. I had no tests. All the testing was done in a manual way. And I started, I thought I was doing good things, I was using inheritance, and turns out the code I was writing was awful. It was just not as awful as the other code that was getting written, in my opinion. But I didn't really know why I was doing it wrong. And the journey for me started when I started to learn about writing unit tests. And that's when I kind of realized that there's probably a better way to do it. Although even at that point, it was hard to get into writing unit tests. I didn't really know how to do it. So the noughties, so I continued developing, became an architect, became a contractor, worked on the Spine project, and then, I'm sure Andy can tell you, I joined Aerodyne about 2005? 4. So Aerodyne was an interesting company to work for me because they were an XP house and they were all about testing and they had very strong opinions about Agile, there's a lot of strong opinions in that organization. And I think Aerodyne were quite important in terms of this organization as it started. So the Extreme Programming Club was something that myself and a couple of others set up when we were at Aerodyne. And one of the motivations that Aerodyne had for setting that up, which I don't think we've ever really talked about, was we were struggling to recruit people who were basically understood what Agile was, what testing was, I don't think I ever actually recruited anyone from the club, but that was the start of the Extreme Programming Club. And so we started in about 2007. We posted, and we had a night in the Victoria Hotel, and that kind of carried on until a couple of years later we rebranded to Agile Yorkshire, and I'll talk a little bit later on why I think we did that. Just to finish off the the biography. Basically, I kind of went away for a little bit. So I got married, divorced, things happen, time passes, and in the last year or so I've set up with 3 of the best developers I've ever worked with, and myself, and a company called Kadira, and part of the reason I'm here now as well is because obviously I realised that, as a CEO, I should probably start coming back to these things again and trying to connect with people. So what I thought I would talk about a little bit is the word agile. One of the things I noticed when I kind of made the decision to move to Kadira from a senior position in a large organisation was that the use of the word agile and what agile meant to different people. And I kind of came to a realisation towards the end of my career before I started at Kadira, that agile as a word was confusing and it wasn't really helping a lot of conversations for me. So back in 2009, we changed the word to Agile. Now, part of the reason we changed to Agile Yorkshire, or one of the motivations I wanted to change it, was away from the Extreme Programming Club. Oh, that reminds me, I had a prop. This was probably about 3 slides too late. But there's the old... thankfully, I still don't think I can fit into that. Never been worn. But one of the problems I had with the naming of the club was the Extreme Programming Club. We were never the Extreme Programming Club. We were always somebody who was interested in extreme programming. Was part of what we were interested in. We were also interested in Agile. We were interested in tech type subjects. But it was a name that was kind of felt like it was forced on us by Aerodyne, who wanted to have a .com type address. And we felt at the time that Agile Yorkshire was kind of covered more. It was more than just XP, and it would allow us to do more and more talks on different topics. And I like the word agile, and I still do like the word agile. But we, I think we thought it was important that we sort of changed it. The other thing is that when I started to talk to people about agile, quite often I have to explain what agile meant. And I think that's actually quite a good thing, because if you have to explain something, then basically you're kind of setting the boundaries of what something is. So you have like a shared understanding. Nowadays, I can be in a lot of meetings with a lot of different people, a lot of different stakeholders, and everyone's using the word agile. But it took me a long time to realise that they weren't talking about the same thing as me. So one of the ones I've got down there is the project manager. The Agile Principles state that. So I remember this quite specifically to a meeting I was having with a supplier, where this person, who was a third party, who was meant to be doing work for me in my position, in my role, so they were meant to be providing a service to me, and they were stating quite strongly that the Agile Principles required us to have these requirements in JIRA. And the process was even worse than that, because the actual process they wanted me to go for was that they would put, if we wrote the requirements in JIRA, in their JIRA, they would then get a BA or analysis to write them up and then pass them on to, and then I would then have to sign off to say that these are definitely the requirements that we want fulfilling. Then they would then pass them on to the developers, and at that point their developers would give me an estimate and a cost. And this was what I was being told was the Agile Principles. And I just kind of realised that a lot of the conversations you have when you talk to different people and different stakeholders, they're talking about different things. Again, certain conversations, Agile is talked about as if it's a definitive thing. So it's, people will say that we're not Agile yet, but we will be when we get Jira, or we will be when we get the business owner. So there's obviously this place that people believe is Agileville or whatever it is. Quite often I hear Agile described in terms of what it's not. So people will talk about, we're Agile now, we're not waterfall. So rather than defining what it is about Agile, they're defining what it isn't. So I don't think that defining things in terms of what they're not is particularly helpful. It's also, there's a tendency when you're saying that it's not waterfall, then you're implying that waterfall is bad. And again, you're not really saying what it is about waterfall that's bad either. So again, this use of language isn't very helpful when we're trying to define what it is we're talking about. And a lot of organizations I talk to, and this is in my previous role and in my current role, when I talk to large organizations or I talk to startups, again, everyone's talking as if they are Agile, and which is kind of interesting. So recently, I went down to London, and then I also did a session up in Leeds about the digital outcomes. So it's a really interesting meeting. And the government was talking about how they've got their new digital framework. It's all about Agile, and they mentioned Agile lots and lots of times. There's a lot of the conversations were about how, in the brave new world, it's very prescriptive what they were saying. So they tried to basically have this framework which they were trying to put together that would describe the Agile process or an Agile process or a framework that would allow you to bid for work. And they were saying again and again that it's Agile. And they even would quote, and you will be Agile as according to the manual. And it was really interesting because they would have they had a set of people up on the stage, all really well-intentioned, all really passionate about what they were doing, but what they were actually also saying was kind of contradictory. They didn't really realize some of the contradictions that they were actually stating. So they say at one point you get somebody which kind of slip out, well, obviously you'll have a fully finished RST up front. It's not going to work without an RST up front. And then on the other hand, you'd get people who completely counter this. And what was apparent to me was a lot of the things they were saying, a lot of the needs of the government framework, which talks about Agile, are actually contradictory in terms of delivery. So they've got all these contradictions, and they don't acknowledge any of these contradictions. They don't ever say that by doing this, you are affecting it in a different direction. It's just all about how everything has to be Agile, and everything has to be, and that somehow that's just the right thing to do, and it's just fixed. And so again, to me, it was interesting. They didn't really define Agile. They put down processes and said, and obviously they're Agile, or they would say, these are Agile processes. But just defining a process doesn't mean that it's Agile. So what was towards the end, it became apparent to me that basically Agile is just an overloaded term. It means different things to different people. And what I started to do, perhaps a little bit late, was if I didn't know what someone meant by Agile, I should actually ask them, what do you mean by Agile? What is it about Agile that you are actually saying is important to you? Because just saying that something is Agile is not really, it's probably going to lead us to problems later. Talk a little bit about Agile in large organizations, because again, there's obviously, perhaps 10 years ago, it was more about Agile was something you would see in small organizations. Now, large organizations all want to be Agile. Again, without defining necessarily what Agile is or what it means to them. But it's interesting because you get large organizations, and it's what I can see in difference, and it's not just the organizations I've worked with directly, it's organizations that I'm being asked to do work for, is they're not just about delivery. It's not that these organizations aren't delivered purely around delivery. They have other things that they have to do as well. So as a large organization, you have a certain amount of bureaucracy, and bureaucracy can be a very good thing. There's reasons why we like bureaucracies. But the needs of the staff, they have things like performance management, they have staff retention, you have to reward staff. Delivering projects isn't always in the interest of the organization or everyone within the organization. So a successful small team of 3 or 4 developers who go away, do 3 months of work and deliver something that changes the organization can cause massive headaches for other parts of the organization. So you've got the operation people or the infrastructure who are now struggling to keep up. And a lot of these things, it's very counterintuitive. So again, it's not about delivery. It's quite often about politics, about the politics, it's about the personalities. It's, and again, quite often you'll find is that you'll have business owners who are paying the checks, and you'll have small teams who are trying to deliver to them, but actually they're being line managed by other people. So the CTO might not be incentivizing you to deliver, because you're actually making their life harder by delivering, as perverse as it sounds. So whilst you might think as a member of a delivery team that if you just nail this delivery, all is good, that's not always the case in my experience. Large organisations like to have standards. So a bit like the government wants to try and describe a digital framework which basically encompasses all the different possibilities. Organisations quite like to have a standard, so they can say, one size fits all. So to give an example slightly away from the SDLC, I was asked in my days as an enterprise architect, after writing a very successful project with some of the people in this room actually, I was asked to go and weigh, okay, you go and weigh and write the reference solutions architecture for all future projects. And I kind of thought about it, and you're kind of thinking, well, what can I say in that? So, I write down, use Java, and, have tests. I would say do TDD would be on my reference architecture. You would absolutely do TDD. But actually, every project is different. So if I actually document a generic process that's going to describe every possible project, it's very hard to do that. It's just impossible. So why would you even try? Surely it's better to actually just, solve the problem for the one you have in hand, and then when you want to do a second one, I'll do your second solutions architecture document that does that. But organisations don't necessarily always like that. And so this became more apparent to us that quite often a lot of the conversations that I was having with people around politics or enterprise architecture or solutions architecture, or how you run your agile processes, whether it's Scrum processes or whatever, was we never really talked about the contradictions. So the people I was dealing with and myself, we tend to be reductionists in our view of the world. So by reductionists, we like to reduce things down to simple arguments. So I'll give you an example. So again, to go back to the technical side of things, coding standards. So these are not dissimilar from the coding standards I actually have personally, which is something like, I want maintainable, readable code. I will delete any comments in the code. Do not repeat yourself, so the dry principle, and Yagni, which is you aren't going to need it. Now those 4 principles, any one of them you can probably justify, but you can extract any one of those to madness as well. So any one of those things in a reductionist world can be, a force for bad. And we do, to this holistic view, is trying to understand what are the dependencies between these things. So, and again, when you're trying to describe a process that encompasses everything, it's quite often, you're going in different directions, and it's hard to actually understand. If you have a principle which is, I will delete any comments, that might be contentious or not, but that's a fairly clear statement. But that, at times that might be a bad thing. I would suggest that more times than not it would be a good thing, but there might be a bad thing at times. What I also noticed is that in organizations, if you're someone like a program manager or someone more on the business side of things, is you can actually bring in, at the risk of upsetting some of the people, but you can bring in some consultants who can then basically tell you about your agile process and say, if you do all these things, then everything will be fine. And looking at the agile process in terms of if it's Scrum you're doing, the stand-ups, when your retrospectives are, your iterative, how long, is it 3 weeks, is it 2 weeks? Those are quite often, it seems like an easy thing to actually fix. But actually what I noticed was that quite often it wasn't the process, it wasn't the agile process that was the problem, and it was the harder problems. So it's about whether the technical people were motivated or not motivated, whether they had the tools to do their job, whether they were trained, whether the architecture was good or not good. These are much harder problems to solve than because they require a lot more effort. So just basically coming in and saying, your stand-ups are too long. I know that's an unfair way to say it, but basically as a business you can look at this and go like, if I could just fix the Scrum process, or I just fix the Agile process. We know we want to be Agile, I can fix that. Looking at the fact that your delivery teams aren't good enough or they're held back because of something, that's a lot harder problem to fix. As organisations as well tend to document their processes, is they quite often they will, and I guess this is a little bit maybe what Ash was saying earlier as well, is that they only tend to add, they don't tend to delete. So it's quite easy when you have a failure, so you're down on a Saturday. Why are we down on a Saturday? Oh, it's because change control didn't know what the problem was. Right, okay, so we'll have a new process that says that the email has to go out to everybody on every team, and also everyone needs to respond back to say they've read and understood it. And after a while, your processes get bigger and bigger, and maybe you should delete a process as well, and try and keep these things a bit more lightweight. But also, this siloed approach is dangerous because Agile talks a lot about cross-functional teams. But in a large organisation, when you've got specific teams who are responsible for doing specific things, and you define that by a tightly written process, for me, the gaps between these silos gets bigger and bigger. So whereas before, in a small team, you're responsible for it all, as you have larger teams, you have more teams with a more defined process, I believe the gaps are bigger. I think this is where people get frustrated with the organisations they work for, because because we're in this reductionist world where you only look at things in isolation, you don't necessarily understand why do I have to do change control. One of the ongoing, or one of the repeating battles I've had over time is about, if we talk about a little bit about testers. One of the things we do test is to assert the quality or otherwise of software. Another reason that we actually do test is because it can be used in an organisation to kind of measure the progress of a project. And you also have line management requirements. So what I found was that part of what the delivery was about, getting something out the door and on the site, but also people were actually doing things that was part of their line management requirements as well. So the testers wanted to know what the quality of the testers was doing. So they had responsibilities to feed back up to a different side of the business what it was they were doing. And so this then led into these conversations we'd have around BDD, unit testing, brittle tests, too many tests, not enough the right tests. And it always seemed, when you have to say, well, the reason we're writing these tests is so that basically the line manager of this person can see that they're doing their job properly. That doesn't always seem rational. But also from an organisational point of view, it does make some sense as well. But developers wouldn't always agree that that was the right thing to do. So these constraints that maybe are coming down from my line manager or the CTO to a development team, don't necessarily make sense. The other thing is that people aren't rational either. So again, a lot of the conversations around what a good agile process was about, quite emotive discussions. So a bit like one of the conversations, Ash basically mentioned a little bit about how they had the conversation about the tests and they should have changed their mind around the tests. I've been on projects where every 6 weeks or 8 weeks we would have a meeting which was about what is a test. And this became quite an emotional journey for the different people in these conversations. So you'd have senior developers, you'd have testers, you'd have BAs, you'd have project managers. And you kind of think that everyone's being rational, and they're not. We all remember the things that, if you look at things like confirmation bias, we'll all quote the bits that suit our part of the world. So the developers are saying, well, all we need is TDD. Testers will say, yeah, but what about that live outage we had? That would have been covered if we didn't have, if we'd have had a better integration test, and so on and so forth. So we kind of always think that there's a truth. There is an absolute truth. And as I kind of look back on some of these projects, I realise a lot of it's actually perception. Or that might just be a consequence of my divorce. So, but where this took me to, though, was that I kind of thought that the word agile, whilst interesting, it's about delivery. And that's kind of, I'm in a fairly lucky position because I've kind of set up my own business and I can now say, okay, that's what my organisation is about. It's about we want to do delivery. So delivery is the thing that I look back on. That's what made me happy. Didn't necessarily get me to where I wanted to be in the organisation, delivery, but it was the thing that I found most fun. And also being part of small teams, that was a fun thing for me. And so that's kind of what I want to focus on now, is how do we deliver, and what's that to do with Agile, which bits of Agile do we take? So that was just what makes you happy, what makes you sad. So when people say, what is Agile, what do I take from Agile? Pretty much The only thing I kind of think is a given is the Agile Manifesto, and I kind of think that the 4, we prefer working software over comprehensive documentation. I think that those 4 things are fairly non-contentious, and I'm kind of happy if everything else that we discuss with Agile we actually define. But I like those 4 things. I don't think there's much there that I would disagree with. The next thing I'd say is, if people ask me how do you become Agile, I would say go and read and practice XP. Go and read the documentation, and for me that's largely a technical behaviours. So it's telling us that we should write unit tests, we should do TDD. So again, we do TDD. I am religious about that. I think that is such an important thing, TDD. I think XP, in a lot of respects, if you follow that, that's almost a prerequisite of Agile or agility or whatever it is that you are trying to achieve. So again, I see a lot of people who describe themselves as Agile who aren't doing the kind of the core things right. So when you're talking about how good is your Scrum process or the SDM or whatever process you're doing, or Kanban, then to me, if you're not writing tests appropriately, if you haven't got a sensible architecture that allows you to make changes and to understand what the consequences of those changes are, then it doesn't really matter what your process is for putting new features in or for prioritizing bugs in that world. And so I do see that discipline from the developers and the delivery team isn't always there. Scrum's okay. I don't really have any strong opinions about Scrum. It's kind of a nice place. I think nowadays a lot of people kind of start with Scrum. It's a nice introduction, and then they move towards Kanban maybe. So I think if you've got a young team, people who've never done Agile, I think it's a good place to start. Seems to be a lot of emotion about Scrum, whether you're doing Scrum properly or you're doing part of Scrum, Scrum but, whatever that is. The interesting one for me is, again, it's a bit about the language. So there is an expectation when you say you're doing Scrum as to what it is you're doing. And again, I've had some interesting meetings with people about Scrum when they've come and said to me, oh, I did Scrum at my last place, you're doing Scrum. I've got some great ideas for how you can improve your process. And this is on day 1, and they've never even seen my process. So there's a lot of these conversations, again, I'm like, okay, let's see how we do it. So I'd like to go a little bit of a detour on the talk now and talk a little bit about Spotify. So I'm guessing that all of you have seen the Spotify slides that are up. Show of hands, anyone? Lots of people have seen them, cool. So these are 2 wonderful slides or presentations done in a really beautiful way. I hope that I have a marketing team at some point that can do that kind of thing for my company. And they're really interesting. What I've also seen is that there has been a lot of talk about large organizations adopting the Spotify model. And that, again, is something that kind of worries me a little bit, because I don't really disagree with anything that's in those slides. But it looks to me, when I look at the Spotify slides, is that this is a process that they've kind of evolved to over a period of time. So if they've got a process that they've actually kind of changed iteratively over time, how can you then just take that whole process and just drop it into your organization as if that's going to be fit for you? There's also, they talk a lot about the autonomy of the squads that they have, how much freedom they have. And again, that's kind of counter to a large organization who will say we want to have one process. So when they're mandating how organizations behave or what the Agile process is, they're not saying we mandate that you can do whatever you want to do. We're saying, you will do these things. I also see that a lot of the interpretations of the Spotify model I've seen are interpretations, and they've just taken part of it. So for instance, they will have a separate team that does the release. And I think a lot of the things that are in the Spotify kind of work together, and they all kind of, so if you take parts of it, you're not really following what they're doing. And again, I think if you look at their architecture, it's actually developed with their process. So they talk about in the slides how they started off with a monolithic desktop, and that didn't help them do releases. So then the desire to do quick releases was then kind of went hand in hand with the idea that they'd actually split the different parts of the app up, and they would actually do, so the architecture and the goal of doing quick releases kind of work hand in hand. And their risk model is interesting as well. Look at, what's the worst that can happen in terms of Spotify, doing a bad release. So, your music appears upside down, or on the video, the images, that their risk profile isn't massive. Whereas if you're a bank, let's say, or a medical record provider, then the risk profile is different. So just adopting wholesale everything that Spotify say they do, and then probably doing a bad version of it, that does worry me a little bit. So this is where I've got to now, is when I get involved with people who ask me to write software for them, because that's what Kadira wants to do. We want to write software for people, is they'll talk to me about Agile, and I'm more interested in looking at what is the problem that you're trying to solve. And so we've kind of coined a term, pragmatic delivery, and what I'm trying to say here is I'm not against Agile, I'm not for Agile. I just find that using Agile is an emotive term and it's overloaded. So I'd rather focus on the delivery. What are the specific needs of the project that you actually have? And what I've realized over time is that delivery quite often is it's a people problem, or a problem, it's probably not the right word. But how do you best manage a group of individuals and get them to deliver is fundamentally the problem that we're trying to solve. And what's become apparent is that it probably requires more of an emphasis on emotional intelligence than perhaps IT groups are kind of given credit for. So, we tend to think of, I consider myself to be somewhere on the continuum between, normality and, Asperger's, or whatever, however you wanted to say. I think, IT individuals do share a lot of commonality down this road, and the jokes about not being able to communicate properly and all these kind of things, there is some truth to that, I would say. Maybe I'm completely wrong about that. And we're not really known as a bunch of individuals who are good at communicating, although I think delivery is about communication. So I think I was trying to went through it. Was it Ian Cooper who did the talk about hexagonal architecture?
Yes.
So I'm sure that Ian said the story about Alistair Cockburn was sent off by IBM. I think me and Andy had heard this story as well, but we couldn't find it on the internet either, so we tried to go and find out if it was true or not. So I had to put folklore has it, so that could be Ian Cooper as well. But he talked about Alistair Cockburn, who is one of the signatories on the Agile Manifesto, was asked by IBM to go off and we want a delivery process that just works. And so he went off and he did his, his Kill Bill kind of walk through, talking to all the senseis and working out all the different ways he could deliver. And he came back at the end of it and he said, so the best way to deliver software is 4 developers and a whiteboard. And IBM said, well, thank you for all that money that we spent getting that answer. That doesn't scale very well. And he goes, no, it doesn't, does it? But I kind of think that's true to a certain extent, and that's kind of the fun projects for me to work on. It's 4 or 5 developers working together in a room. Communication's good. A lot of the stuff that becomes less fun is when you're having 16, 20 developers and then 20, 30 people who are also associated to that team. And so one of the things that I try and look at problems is that most problems, 4 developers can just solve most IT problems in 3 to 6 months. That's what I always kind of say. And then Andy looks at me and goes, you can't give that commitment, David. But largely all the problems that, you can solve anything in 3 to 6 months with 4 developers if you've got good developers. And part of your responsibility, if I'm doing the architecture, should be to split this problem down into chunks that can be solved in 3 to 6 months. And you give those 3 or 4 developers the best chance to deliver. And it's a lot cheaper if those people are going to fail. Autonomous teams. I think that is really, really important. So I think, yes, there's a quote there from Spotify where he talks about why is autonomy important? Because it's empowering. And I really agree with that. So quite often, going back to, there's different tensions. Quite often I think you're better if I've got a team or a young team and I ask them to solve a problem for me and they come back and here's what we're going to do. We're going to use these 3 technologies and we're going to do da-da-da-da. If they're largely right, if their technology is 90%, 80% right, so you've chosen Node, added on it in Java, that's fine. you let them do it, in my opinion. So you just say, okay, that's fine. So you made the decisions. And if I think they've completely got it wrong, then I'll say no. I do say no, that is just a bad idea. But largely, even if they haven't solved the problem, I would solve the problem, you let them do it. That's what delegation's about. Because by them making the decision, they feel empowered and they feel like stakeholders in actually delivering that. And I think that's a really powerful part of getting small groups to deliver. And I think that's one of the problems that large organisations and the involvement from architecture can be as well. So as someone who has been an enterprise architect and a solutions architect, I've kind of, as an architect, if I tell for people how to do a problem, they tend not to be that. If they disagree, they almost become stakeholders in watching that fail. So it's much better to actually say, so how would you solve this problem? And hope that they're within 90% of the right answer, and if they are, then you just let them go. Again, pragmatic delivery, emergent architecture. So a bit like when you talk about TDD or you talk about emergent architecture, you kind of say you do TDD or you say you do emergent architecture, and it's quite a simplistic thing to say. What I rely on is doing TDD, there's a very set of rules that you do, but there's still a lot of skill that comes through experience with doing TDD right, and it's about part of what Ash was touching about, which is there's areas you need to concentrate on, and there's bits which are not providing you as much value, and it's about knowing the answer to these questions. And that comes through skill or experience. So when I talk about emergent architecture, people say, oh, you can't just make it up as you go along, David. Is that what you're advocating? And it's kind of like, well, I'm just saying that you've probably got 3 or 4 developers who are actually very, very good, who largely are architects. But they prefer to code. And so, have they thought about multi-threading? Yes. But are they going to document and test around these things? Not just yet, because that's not necessary. So the problems we think you're going to have on this journey, we have thought about, but we're not explicitly documenting them to the nth degree at this point in time. And you allow that architecture to basically emerge or bubble up. And yeah, a lot of architecture can be common sense. It is about, and it's about understanding the impact of the decisions you're making. One of the points I haven't got on there is I was in a meeting where people were talking about how we just don't want to make the wrong decision, or we want to make the right decision now. That was it. They're saying, look, we've got to make the right decision now. And I was thinking, well, that's interesting that in the first meeting or the second design meeting is you're really keen to make the right decision now, because actually what I would rather do is not make the wrong decision. So I think it's a lot, if I can defer making a decision for as long as possible, so I'm not going to narrow down the possible worlds, then that's a much better place to be rather than trying to make the right decision now. I've got a note there which talks about, as a dev manager, I would get a lot of agencies or would tell me that they've got a developer who wants to be an architect. And I always wanted architects who wanted to be developers. Until a little bit further, I want developers who want to be testers. I want developers who are basically testing all the time. I guess this is maybe a comment about the architecture as well, and it's about risk management. It's about thinking about what's the worst that can happen. So quite often, if you look at all the possible ways that you can fail on a project, you can always think of a new edge case where if your resilience fails and the dark fiber between your 2 data centers goes down, and someone turns off one of the databases, then you're going to lose a transaction. And so there's always a non-functional requirement that can scupper you. So it's just kind of saying, but realistically, can we just do this in a risk management? It's about getting something out there in a safe way and getting feedback, doing it. So, for instance, one of the projects I worked on was writing betting models for football matches. So what's the worst that can happen? Well, probably that I put out the wrong price on the England match when you've got lots and lots of people. So from a risk management point of view, why don't we just put it out on a 4th division football match? And it's about thinking about, what is the downside to doing this? So I'm going to go a slight detour again on this journey and talk again about the people side. And again, this was something that took me a long time to work out. which was about dealing with people in teams. Kind of there's an assumption that everyone kind of is the same sort of person as yourself. So you think about, why do I code to work? Why do I do what I do? And on some level, if you read Maslow, Theory of Human Motivation, that will talk about, once you've got your basic needs, you've got your food, you've got your shelter, what motivates you. And, money's in there somewhere. So I'm sure that most people say they go to work for financial reasons. And it turns out that, financially, it is a motivational tool for a while. So if you give someone a promotion and pay them more money, that probably works for a month or two. But it's about thinking about, why do people do what they do? What is it? Some people are motivated because they like to be part of a team. Some people care about people and they're interested in looking after their colleagues or empathizing with people. Some people kind of see problems as intellectual problems. So they want to sort out what is they want to think about it. They want to be left alone in the corner just to think about the problem and solve the problem. And that's what, gives them a buzz. Other people are not only motivated, but are mainly motivated by delivering. All they want to do is just deliver. So these are people who just want to get stuff out the door. They just want to. And quite often, if you just think that everyone's motivated the same as your motivations, then I think that's a mistake. And if you're not sure what people's motivations are, you can always ask them, because guessing what they are can be bad as well. I think the point I'm trying to make here is that when you put a team of, let's say, 3 developers, 2 testers, 1 BA, 1 project manager, 1 scrum master, if that's the setup of your agile team, the delivery team is, each person might have a different motivation when you're trying to work it out. And so if you actually think a little bit about what is it that motivates people, why do they care? Why was that person here at 6 o'clock last night? What I have found useful, as I've kind of looked at Scrum and Agile, whatever Agile means, is I found that Lean's quite helpful to me now, and I tend to think more in terms of Lean. And when I talk about Lean now, I'm thinking it's about optimizing. So one of the things from a technical point of view, I'll say, if you've got some software, don't optimize it up front. Optimize it when you realize there's a bottleneck. And the way you realize the bottleneck is that you measure it. And then you look to see if by making a change, you can increase the speed or the throughput or whatever it is you're trying to change. And I think Lean's quite good for me, because it basically says, this is what you need to focus on. You need to optimize, and you need to basically take what you've got and try and improve it. This, again, I think is a better way to deal with the world than to have a big bang. So rather than tearing up everything you've got and saying, okay, we're going to drop the squad process or whatever, we say, okay, no, what we're going to do is we're going to look at what we've got now, and we're going to take small steps towards the Spotify model, because that's probably going to be better than what we have now. So yes, I guess this slide is saying a little bit about the fact that in this reductionist world where you have lots of passionate views, is that quite often a lot of the arguments aren't that helpful. But it's interesting, it does show the passion of the team. So this is more about the Lean side. So Lean talks a little bit about different types of waste. And largely the thing I tend to do, just get a response from people and get a kind of emotional response, is I just tell everyone that everything they do is waste. And I'm probably right, unless you're coding. Now, and then I'm only partially right. So I remember one of the meetings I was in, I think it was me, head of audit, program manager, project manager, BA, and we all sat around the table, and the audit person was saying, well, David, I think we're all agreed that in a perfect world, we'd have unlimited resource to write all the documentation you could ever possibly need. And everybody kind of nodded sagely, and I said, no, it's all waste. And I got a very strong reaction from people, which was part of the reason why I said it, but also I actually believe that as well. What about a user guide? Wouldn't a user guide be really useful to you? If you had a perfect user guide, it's out of date as soon as you write it. And wouldn't you rather have software that didn't need a user guide? And that challenge to them was because obviously the audit people, part of what they were doing was they were auditing the processes that I was putting in place, and that's part of their jobs. And part of what I was saying is that no, what you do is all waste. Now, that obviously, that's a little bit of, well, no, it's a little bit, yeah, they probably got me in a bad day, but I'd probably do the same thing as well again. And the interesting thing is that there's different types of waste. So I think, in some definitions, then you would say that the unit tests that your developers are writing is a form of waste. All that matters is the binary that's deployed ultimately. So those unit tests are a form of waste. Probably more so if they're written after the event than if they're written TDD. But some waste we accept. So we accept that basically, writing unit tests is a useful activity and it does increase the quality, but it's still waste. Other things we need to hunt out and kind of get rid of, which is waste that is just waste. And that's where kind of, for me, large organizations do excel, is they have all these processes that largely they're just doing them because they've always done them. So we need to audit this because we have a requirement. There needs to be an audit. And it's like, who needs an audit? And so you get these crazy processes. And again, these processes quite often mirror the organization as well. So you actually find that the structure, the people who are in the organization and the departments they're in, that's what's driving these different processes. So I've done 50 minutes. I wasn't sure because I hadn't had a chance to time it. So I've got 3 or 4 other slides I can quickly run through. How are we doing for time? A couple more. So these are a couple of things that I've kind of noticed over my time. And so at the moment, the job market in Leeds for developers, I can't believe I'm showing a slide that's got graduates developers on 32,000. I've got one of my graduates in the room as well. So probably he'll be using that in his next conversation with me. The job market in Leeds is going a little bit crazy. And there's obviously a lot of teams are talking about how they only employ the top 1%, which is obviously a nonsense. But it's something I used to believe as well. I used to believe I only employed the top 1% or top 10% or whatever that ratio is. So if you leave aside the bad stats or the fact that you probably what you might be saying is that you only employ 10% of the CVs that go to your HR team, which is completely different to you only employ the top 10%. What I think this is, with organisations like Sky coming to Leeds because the market in London is so crazy, and then paying the same prices as London, it's kind of an interesting strategy. And I think what I've realised is that developers are really important, but it's also about the process you put in place. So it's about, are you doing TDD appropriately? Are you giving these people the right things? Can we train them up? Can we take average, whatever that means, or just okay developers and make them into really productive? So whereas before I would have said it's all about getting the right people in the room, I think largely it is, but it's also about showing people how to do these things. Okay, Agile and architecture, what was I going to say in this one? Toby Sukroff, who's probably a name that some of you might remember. You might remember Toby. So Toby and myself worked closely when we were at Aerodyne, and we worked at William Hill together quite closely. So he's always quite scathing of parts of Agile, and he says he looks at the manifesto and he'll kind of rally at me or rail at me and say, oh, Agile just doesn't help architects. Nothing in there tells you that, some problems you need to write large. You need to do some proper architecture. And it's done so much damage, this idea that Agile can just do emergent. And you're kind of going, yeah, maybe, but also, why does that manifesto have to have an opinion about architecture? Isn't that a separate problem? But I do think that Agile and the adoption of Agile has made a lot of job roles or job descriptions difficult, or they've changed them. So I guess my point about that one is kind of, I don't agree with you, Toby, that Agile makes, which doesn't score many points because he's not here. A lot of people I work with in IT like to play games. So an example might be, I will arbitrarily say that I want 90% test coverage done in a TDD way. And I treat that completely as a game. And if a developer wants to game me by writing unit tests around their DTOs or whatever to get their coverage up to 90%, that's kind of fine, because I know it's better than just saying nothing and getting 72% test coverage or whatever it is. So kind of quite often in life or in delivery, you're trying to work out what are the games, how are people gaming each other. And if you look at how people learn games, the first kind of thing is that you do when you learn a game is you learn the rules of the game. So you need to look at what is the game, and what is the game we're playing, what are the rules of this game that we're playing. And then you need to work out, well, how am I going to play? What's my strategy in this game? What is it I'm trying to do in this game? And then as you get better, you then think, well, how is the other person who's playing the game? How are they going to behave? So again, it's about stepping back and having a think about people's motivations. Why are they doing things? Are they playing games? And not in a negative way. I think the fourth step in game theory is if you're playing online poker is at some point you have to work out how does the other person think I'm behaving. But I can't work out how that analogy works for this delivery. So I didn't make it onto a slide. Whoops, wrong way. Roles in Agile. So I was kind of hoping I would run out of time before I did this. So what I kind of get is 3 or 4 people in a room writing code with the whiteboard, and I've seen that work really, really well. And as we put project managers, BAs, testers, architects, infrastructure, all these different people is that the story gets harder and harder for me personally. And I think that is one of the things that I don't know what the answer is actually, because large organisations do have reasons for these roles to exist. But if you've got small teams, I think their value is less than another developer. So usually if you ask me, do you want a 5th developer or do you want a project manager? I'm usually going to say I have a 5th developer. Do you want a 5th developer or a BA or a Scrum Master or a tester? I'm usually going to say I'd rather run the developer. So sorry if I've offended everyone in the room. And I don't know what the takeout from that is either. That's just what I've seen kind of work. But that's not to mean that these other roles can't provide value. All the teams that I've run have had these people in there, and they've, So for me, what I like is when testers and BAs, when their roles tend to merge, when they get involved early on and they're actually collaborating with the developers. Again, it's the point you were making, Ash, is that if they're working together closely, quite often developers, they're not going to read Jira, they're not going to read the RSD, so they do, it is helpful if you've got a BA or a tester who's going to sit and say, this is what we need to, and that can be specified in terms of unit tests, hopefully written in a TD way. I'll get back to you in a year about architects. So I think the takeouts is, rather than talking about are we agile or do we become agile or how do we become agile, it's what is it about agile that you think is important, and to actually name that thing. So if it's about releasing early, then talk about how do you release early. If it's about understanding, why does the take from the developers making a change to the code and it takes 3 weeks for us to go live with that, surely that should be a week. Then solve that problem. And if you want to optimize things, if you want to improve the process, then you need to record. You need to basically have some sort of KPI for success. Again, when we talked about the cognitive biases, we tend to be very good at picking out the data that suits our kind of worldview. So hopefully data. And it can be hard to pick that data. This is a blog from a blog post that I did with when I was at Aerodyne with Phil Rice. 2007 it turns out. And the point this blog post was trying to make was it's about there's different types of projects. So again, you tend to have one agile process that basically covers all these different types of projects. And actually there's some fundamentally different types of problems that a delivery team might basically face. So what this slide, I don't know if it's legible or not, is trying to show is the fact that where you understand the problem and you've got an experienced team, the way you would solve that problem is different to if it's a problem where it's called a voyage of discovery. So in a voyage of discovery, you know what the problem is, but you don't know how to fix that problem. So there's a different strategy as to how you would solve that type of project. And that might also affect what you expect the team to behave. So dare I say that if you're doing the same job over and over time, so if you're writing, your first app for Leeds United, and then you write your second app for Manchester United, and you write your third app for Manchester City, then perhaps by that time, you need less tests around certain areas of that story because you are just rinsing and repeating. So your strategy there might be that you change certain of the requirements for that delivery. Most projects, I believe, live in this world here. So you're tending to do something where you've got a fairly good team, you're not quite sure how to solve the problem, and so there, you probably are writing, because by definition, once you solve one problem, you move on to the next problem. So this came out to me, I guess it's partly, I think Royd's got the lean startup, and you talked there, I think one of the takeouts for me about the lean startup was about the prioritization. So when you talk to startups, I've talked to a couple of startups, quite often they will love to talk to you about the problems they're going to have when they're Google or when they're Facebook, and actually you probably want to focus them on the fact that you need to get through the next 3 months and trying to bring in this realism. And again, this comes back to an emergent or a pragmatic architectural style, which is different to how you would behave in a large organisation because there's a lot more certainty. So what it is you're trying to deliver in a large organisation where they're not going to be bust in 3 months is obviously different. So yes, to finish off then, a lot of what I'm saying is that we tend to only know the full truth about a project at the end. I think that was something that Ash would kind of voice. So that every project I've worked on, I've known a lot more about that project at the end than I have at the start. But we always, and for me, hopefully, Agile gives us the tools to try and defer some of those decisions until it's appropriate to make those decisions. And enjoy the journey. And then I finished with a quote from David Bower that contradicts everything I've said.